Hi, good morning everyone, and welcome to this morning's webinar. My name is Tom Phillis, and on behalf of the European Commission, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this morning's eArchiving webinar and today's session. Moving on, today we're going to be having a look at the practical applications of digital archiving and specifically submission agreements. Before we get started this morning, we have some basic ground rules. As you can see by the little notification, there is a chat box for Q&A and discussions, so please do share your thoughts and your questions and your ideas there. We do ask that you do this anonymously, and this is so that we can publish the recording respecting the European Commission's data protection rules, so using the anonymous function, or at least a nom de guerre, and we will endeavour to answer your questions as we go forward. This will be done in the chat and also by today's speaker, and we'll also publish written Q&A answers for any we don't get time for. And as I just alluded to, we'll publish today's session. So a quick look at what's on today's menu. So I'll be giving a quick welcome word on the overall programme and the building blocks funded through CEF. We then have Dr. Jamie Kaminski, who's going to look at the eArchiving building block. We then have our main presenter, Bjorn Skog, who's CEO and Senior Preservation Strategist, and he's going to present first on eArchiving and submission agreements, and then the specifications and profiles. And then we'll have a harmonized or a single Q&A session, but you can submit your questions and comments as we're going forward. So moving on to a few welcome words from me. These slides are not entirely the most contemporary, as I think regular listeners will know. We're currently in the middle of, in the transition period between two European Union budgetary cycles, and the transition from the Connecting Europe facility to the Digital Europe programme. The Connecting Europe facility will still continue to exist and fund areas of strategic interconnection between EU member states, but not funding the same digital solutions as it has been for the past 5 years. But as we are currently waiting for the publication of the work programs relating to the Digital Europe programme, we currently don't have any information that we can share on how the next programme will look. To date, the Connecting Europe facility has funded digital solutions in the area of telecom. The CEF programme is established through a regulation. How this regulation can be used to distribute finance is then further refined through the CEF telecom guidelines, and then annual work programmes stipulate the detailed work to be covered in each year. Here we can see the catalogue of building blocks that have so far been funded through the Connecting Europe facility. The Big Data Test Infrastructure is a standards-based sandbox environment for public administrations and public EU projects to experiment with big data sets and gain insights on how to make data-driven decisions and leverage on data sets. Complementing this, the Context Broker is an API-based solution that allows for the reuse of data in real time to build smart solutions. The eArchiving building block, we will cover in some detail today, so no need to go into that. The European Blockchain Services Infrastructure, or ESSAR, building block is a European-level blockchain infrastructure based on several use cases, so notarization, diplomas, self-sovereign identity, etc. The e-invoicing building block supports the uptake of electronic invoicing respecting the European standard, therefore increased and more efficient cross-border electronic invoicing, and supporting the digitalization of the public procurement process more widely. The eID, e-delivery, and e-signature building blocks all relate strongly to the eIDAS regulation on authentication and trust services in the internal market. For any of you present who might be familiar with the eIDAS regulation, the eID building block supports the interconnection of national eID means, allowing for the authentication of EU citizens in other member states using their nationally issued electronic ID. The e-delivery building block supports the secure exchange of data across borders through a decentralized node system. And the e-signature building block supports the creation and verification of electronic signatures in line with pan-European legal frameworks on electronic signatures, namely the eIDAS regulation. And finally, the e-translation building block is a solution that as an API can be implemented into a cross-border public service to make it multilingual, or for SMEs and EU public servants can be used as a standalone translation tool where intellectual property, etc., remains with the person who has submitted the text or document for translation, and not with the translation tool itself, as is the case with some online translation solutions. So that was a quick look at the overall catalog of building blocks. Each building block has its own unique service offering, and obviously we'll touch upon the service offering of eArchiving specifically today. But generally, these services include training sessions, sample software, performance testing services. How to reuse a building block, again, you will learn some more detail on this element today specifically for eArchiving, but the basic ways in which you can engage and reuse a building block in your project is to buy a compliant solution from the market. So this means that the sample softwares and standards promoted by the European Commission through the building blocks are, of course, provided on the market by IT service and solution providers. Or you can reuse the sample software provided directly by the European Commission and provided on the CEF digital platform, the link to which you'll have at the end of this session. Or you can build a solution from scratch from the core constituent standards. As said, each building block is slightly unique in exactly how it's constructed and what services or sample software, etc., are available. But these, I think, are the core guiding principles that will help you best utilize a building block in your project and ensure that European standards and therefore interoperability are at the heart of the projects and services that you're running. Wonderful. Okay. Well, with that, I hand over to our next speaker, Dr. Jamie Kaminski. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave today's session at this point, but I hope to join you later on. But I leave you in the capable hands of Jamie. Please, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. So, fantastic introduction as always. As Tom mentioned, I'm the head of training at the eArchiving building block. And I'd like to welcome you to what is the 14th of our training webinars. And this one's quite special. It is the last webinar of our spring season. So welcome. Today we're going to be looking at the practical applications of digital archiving. And this is the second of a two-part webinar that focuses this week on submission agreements. And to give this, we have Bjorn Skirg back again. Now, as regular listeners will no doubt know, I usually say a few words at the beginning about the background to eArchiving, and today is no exception, but I promise I will keep it brief. So the building block was created in late 2018. Its aim is to provide specifications, software, training, knowledge, all to help people preserve and reuse information over the long term. Now, all of this information can be found on the building block website. You can see a screenshot on the screen now. I'll provide a link in the chat box after I've finished. Next slide, please. So, in terms of what we do, well, we provide a variety of eArchiving services. So, for example, we maintain technical specifications. In our case, the principal core specification is the Common Specification for Information Packages, or CSIP. We also provide open source tools that you can download and use straight away. We also have compliance and validation services that ensure that the specifications are followed. We've also got a service desk. And I'll provide a link to that in the chat box as well, because that's another important service that that we provide. In addition, we also have outreach and community engagement services and activities. We're developing a training offering, of which this is a part. And yeah, well, basically our training is very much at the moment constrained by the pandemic. So I don't foresee any face-to-face training, certainly for the remainder of this year. So just bear that in mind. Next slide, please. Very quickly, a brief overview of our forthcoming webinars. So as I said, this webinar brings our spring season to a close. So we'll have a break over the summer. And then we will resume our sessions in September. And as you can see, we've got already booked sessions on the eArchiving reference architecture. We've got sessions on validation and sessions on eArchiving geospatial data. So there's still a lot of interesting stuff for you to see in the coming months. Next slide, please. So, as Pavel mentioned, the webinars will be recorded and they'll be made available on the eArchiving webinar webpage, which again, you can see a screenshot of here. Although this page may be revamped in the coming months, but you will have access to a PDF of the slide deck, the recording of the webinar itself, and also a transcription of any Q&A that takes place during the webinar. Next slide. You can also find our recordings directly on the CEF digital YouTube channel, which I always point out because it's a great resource in its own right. You know, it doesn't just contain videos from the eArchiving building block, it also contains videos from all the other building blocks. So it's really useful. Great resource. Have a look if you haven't done so already. Next slide. So our webinars are part of a broader range of outreach activities that include things like workshops and presentations at conferences. Obviously, as I said, this is somewhat curtailed by the pandemic, but we will resume this as soon as we can. In terms of communications, we've got a LinkedIn group. You can see the details on the screen. We've also got a Twitter handle. So if you haven't signed up to the social media, please do so. Next slide, please. So finally, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Once again, as I said, we've got Björn Skog. Björn is the CEO at ES Solutions, and he's a senior consultant within strategic digital preservation. He has more than 25 years of experience in information lifecycle management, especially digital preservation and long-term preservation. So Björn, over to you.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you for that introduction and presentation. As Jamie mentioned, my name is Björn Skog. I'm the CEO and one of the senior preservation strategists at the company ES Solutions, one of the partners in the eArch project family. I'm also one of the founder of the company back in 2002, and we've participated in the first eArch project named eArch, and the former one named eArch for All, and the ongoing present project named eArch 3, which will end in October this year. And we appreciate and love to be in these kind of projects. Today I'm going to talk about practical applications of digital archiving. I'm going to focus on submission agreements and related profiles. I'm going to explain what all this is from our perspectives. But first, do we really need agreements? Quite sure some of you will say no, some of you will say yes, of course. But from my perspective, it creates a solid foundation for common understanding so that we together can collaborate on specific issues. And all the details that we advise to be covered in a submission agreements, they can be categorized and sub-optimized. And these are the ones that we think are important to cover. It could mean that we need to define in the agreements what sort of technology to use in order to secure long-term accessibility for preserved information. It could be a financial issue, could be something that needs to be sorted out in relation to accountability. It needs to be securing continuity. There might be different perspective on what we mean by continuity. And most certain it will be in line with the compliance, regulations, laws, and so on. So all these categories and all these details needs to be covered in an agreement. And we need to keep in mind that we, from this perspective, needs to find a solid foundation. And what we mean by solid, that can vary, but it creates a common understanding and also secure how we should address different issues over the period that we define that this agreement should cover in order to secure the accessibility to preserved information. So what do we need in a submission agreement from our perspective? We think that is really important to agree upon who are the stakeholders who have interest in this digital long-term preservation accessibility. Of course, there will be producers, the one who creates the information about to be preserved in an archive. And we also need to define who's the consumers. Producers can be consumers, but they can be different, separated consumers versus producers. There will be, of course, solution and or service providers, and we do need to be compliant with the things that's an output from the regulatory agencies or policymakers, etc. All these kind of stakeholders, it's really important to find out who are they, what do they do, when do they do what. And of course, in order to find out the accountability, who's responsible of all these things that appears and occur in an old archival workflow, we need to find out the roles, who's doing what, etc. And we need to define and specify those numbers and those details in a submission agreement. We think this is really important. It is sometimes quite a challenge to do this because if you're in a large organization and you have your archive institution or your archive functionality or business operations within the organization, it's sometimes convenient to talk in together about all the archival workflow issues. But if you're separated, if you're a different organization, for example, if you're for a governance or sending your information to a national archive in order for them to preserve and to secure accessibility or long-term perspectives, you have different roles. And you might also discuss who is responsible, who's the ownership of these. But together, you need to be compliant with all the regulations and laws. And you need to understand why you're doing all these digital long-term preservations. And one thing that's really important, we think, is that we need to address and secure the continuity issues. It could be in relation to business operations. It could be in relation to maintenance. It could be maintenance of the information that you're about to preserve and access over a period, who will access it when, and so on. How do you maintain those objects? Service and support, of course, if it's a technical issue, could be. And one of the things that's really important today is sustainability. How do we secure that? And how do we define and specify those details in a submission agreement? Trustworthiness is really important. We need to find out how we can secure authenticity of the objects, of the procedures, of the routines, of the processes, and so on. We also need to find out if there's any issues in relation to the reputation. We can use, because this is something that is not, if we go back 2 decades, if we compare with what was available 2 decades ago in relation to what we have today, we are very, very much mature today to discuss submission agreements worldwide. So it's really important to find and use those kind of models and checklists that already exist. We do have, I mentioned a few here, the OAS model, for example, for the process framework. There's an upcoming interoperability framework from the OAS family. And we also have the PIMAS, the PIEs, the trust and the FAIR principles, and so on. So it's not like you're inventing something from the beginning. You can use the methods, you can use the models, and you can use the checklist in order to collect, to define, and to specify a agreement. We also need to cover the security issues. I mean, how do we secure information integrity? How do we secure the infrastructure? It's really important. And if this submission agreement should be covering deliveries for many years, could be decades or so, we need to be certain about how should we address changes within the technical infrastructure, because they will most certainly occur. So we need to cover the short and long-term perspective on the technology issues, the migration part, because that will occur if you have a submission agreement that covers many years and so on. We need to consider the preservation strategy, the physical carriers, if it's important. From some reason it might be, capacity, performance issues, and so on. It's really important to cover these as well in the submission agreement. And you can use different kind of standards. What we address when we say standards, like, for example, you use for package constructions, you use the METS standard in the eArch specifications. And the standard as such is adopted and specified as specification from within the project eArch. We do have national differences. We have, for example, in the project I'm going to show you how we use and how we address the technical application perspective of the submission agreement. We use specifications within Sweden and within Norway, and we have the eArch specification, but they all address an adoption of a standard, a METS, for example, for the packages part. And what we do, we also need to cover the standards used for the content as such. So you can use different kind of metadata standards for those kind of purposes. And of course, this is something that needs to be covered by foundation of funding somehow, because it most certainly will cost some money doing all these things that you need to do. And it should be related, and it should be addressed, defined, and specified in a submission agreement. So what we really think that's important is that you create a submission agreement and you add all these numbers, all the details you have into some sort of statement you can address as in a submission agreement. And to collect all these details, you will discover that you will, from time to time, have to reevaluate and change different kind of numbers and figures, because they do change. That is one thing that is really, really clarified, that changes will occur. So now we've covered what we need to have in a submission agreement from our perspective. But how do we make a solid foundation of this? I mean, we can address some building blocks based on these categories and those sections divided into a submission agreement. And we can, over the time, specify, and as we know by today, changes that we are aware of and changes that we are more unsecure about, and changes that we don't know at all. So you need to define a solid ground of what you know by today and be prepared for changes, because they will occur. So if you create a foundation and you over time will measure how you will achieve different kind of things, we often address and suggest and advise that you should bring up some sort of key performance indexing. And why you should use those numbers and those indexing is that you will most certainly find out how are we succeeding, how is our progress, and so on. The thing is that you're based on a submission agreement can actually measure your maturity over the time you specified. But what if you over time needs to find out that you would like to extract something, because it's a lot of changes in this area? You could also address and add all the different details that is really important for you within that organization. So you could actually extract and add a new block in your solid foundation. It could be covering sustainability, because it's really important. It needs to be explicitly expressed, not covered by the continuity block and so on. It might, if it's a service or solution provided, you provide eArchiving services, you provide digital preservation services. Revenue could be very important for you. Could be really important if you measure what you mean by revenue. Could be not just expressed in explicit money, and so it could be many different kinds. And of course, accessibility is really important. One of the base foundations and basic ideas about archiving is that you will manage, store, and preserve information in order to make them accessible. And you can add any other things, but it's really important that you create a solid foundation based on what you know and have stated in the agreement you define and agree upon within those partners, those parties that are addressed in relation to that agreement. But do not forget that agreements need to be reevaluated over time. So please do that. It's really important. So if we do have a submission agreement and all these categorized are defined and specified, how do we make a technical application of that? What we are aware of is that we do need to respect and secure changes over time, and different things changes more periodically and more frequent than other things. So it's really important to cover those variations, and in order to do that, we address those changes upon a template mechanism where we use profiles as a group of details addressed in order to comply with the submission agreement. But a submission agreement, it needs to be unique in a technical application. We need to have a unique identifier that addresses this submission agreement. And we also need to find out what's the characteristics of the submission agreement. Do we need to know anything about this submission agreement that needs to be documented? And we also need to know the status of the submission agreement, if it's a draft or if it's something that you already have agreed. So it could be something that you evolve and you use it in a test environment in order to secure if this submission agreement could be finally stated and agreed upon. So you can use it in different kind of stages as well, if you prefer that. And you need to be certain if it's agreed upon and it's finalized and you have all these details covered in the submission agreement, you can publish it. And publish it, it means in our terms that you are making it available for different kind of purposes. And from a technical perspective, I'm going to show you in the applications later on what this means. And storage policy might be something that you think that why is it covered here, addressing a submission agreement. Yes, it's really important because if you remember the technology aspects, it could be cost efficient to cover the storage policies. It could be in relation to your preservation strategy. You mean you have a single object, an information object to preserve, but in your preservation strategy addresses that you need to store this on two different separated geographically located eArchiving repositories, digital repositories. So, and it could be within a digital repository or it could be on the storage infrastructure level. And what we do in ESSArch is that we use storage policy that addresses different kind of storage methods. So for example, if you have in your preservation strategy decided and defined that you should, for those kind of deliveries according to this submission agreement, we should store the objects on a physical carrier, which is represented by a disk storage infrastructure, and one copy on a tape infrastructure. So those storage policies are important to address. And what we also combine with this is the indexing part and the search and accessibility functionality in ESSAR. And I'm going to show that. But these are the overall details that we need to find out that defines the submission agreement within a technical application. But we also need to, from the submission agreement, address certain detail that relates to packages. If you, for example, extract some sort of information, groups of information objects into a package, we can address it as a submission information package, a SIP, that's being transferred from the producer into the archive. We can transform those into different kind of structure, different kind of set of metadata and so on. It's also related to packages, but it could be the archival information packages, and also the packages provided and accessed by a consumer in order to submit and disseminate those information packages, the DIPs, so to say. So the packages is really important. The content as itself is really self-explanatory, because the content is really important to be able to index in order to provide search and finding, access aids, and so on. So we need to describe, based upon the submission agreement, what might be of interest from a producer perspective, from a consumer perspective, to provide to be able to access this content. What sort of metadata do we need? And of course, there are also internal profiles. We address them internal profiles, and I'm going to show you what it is. One example is, how do we, according to the submission agreement, prefer to have automatic workflows, semi-automatic, or manual steps within an automatic or totally manual workflow? What sort of quality assurance should be received? What sort of requirements do the archival institution have and address to the partners who is represented as a producer or a consumer? But packages, we use different kind of profiles in order to secure version management of a specification. So if we, for example, look into the eArch specification for the submission information packages, we have the MET standard, where we in the eArch project create the specification upon an adoption of the standard, and we create a profile upon and based on that specifications. And we do that in order to manage and to fulfill version management requirements. We do the same thing for the specification, the national specifications provided by authorities in Sweden and in Norway as well. And these are really important to define. They cover a lot of things. So if you go through the specifications, you will see that there are a lot of metadata represented. So these ones are the one we address for the SIP, for the AIP, and for the DIPs. In ESSArch, we also cover generation management of IPs. We use the term word from the OAS model, the AIC, it's the Archival Information Collection, and it provides functionality to support generation management of IPs. That means that if you, over the years, need to do preservation planning and preservation actions, you can actually keep the original IP, and the one that you process doing preservation actions on, you can create that as a new generation of the original one. So this is the support, and these are the figures and details that we need to address in relation to the profile for AIC. We also have submit description. Submit descriptions is the description of the delivery of the SIP. And we also are able to define premise event logging. We're using the standard premise for registering and addressing events automatically, but you're also able to do this manually in the tool. But we can state what sort of event that should occur in the whole archival workflow process. And you can add your own premise event, you can add your own event, stack of events and so on in order to do it automatically or manually. So these are the figures that is being extracted from the submission agreements, defined and specified in specific profiles for the SIP, for the AIP, for the DIP, AIC, SD, and the event part. We do it very similar to the content part, because as we do in the eArch project, we provide content information type specification. The specification is based upon a standard. For example, if you look into the ERMS, it's based on MOREC from the original beginning. And you need to cover many kind of details that is covered into the kind of content you are actually providing from a producer into the archive. So these kind of specifications, we create profiles on those as well. We also have the preservation descriptive information, the PDI. It's an OAS terminology. It creates technical preservation metadata and abilities and functionalities to keep track of what's happening with the objects within a digital repository. The last two ones here is represented in order to support and describe the archival description and the archival context. It's about who's creating what and how it's created. These are really really important to have, because we have an within ESSArch a fully covered archival description functionality. The last one is about ESSAR profiles. We can define, for example, specific transfer profiles. That means if you transfer from a producer to the digital repository or the archive or the archival institution, your submission, it could be on a physical carrier, it could be electronically, it could be required that you use different kind of encryption, check some algorithm and so on. So these kind of profile is really important to address. The data selection profiles and the input profiles, it's simply expressed that if you want to extract something from a source system in order to select the data, these profiles are used to address policies or strings. So you can use different kind of tools like DBA preservation toolkits in order to use those tools in an action and address these profiles to select sort of data from the source system. And import profiles, it's related to the data selection because it certifies that you are able to import into the digital repository. And one of the most important profiles we have in the ESSArch functionality is the workflow profiles. It enables you to create fully automated workflows. That means that if you, from a records management system, creates on a daily basis records sampling or output and export it on a specific area, ESSArch will, based on these workflow profiles, fetch every data, transfer it, do all the quality assurances, do all the things when you do the SIP to AIP conversion or transformation, and store it into the digital repository. It can be fully automated, and this is something that you should be aware of when you create the submission agreement, because it might sometimes be of interest, because this submission agreement from one organization could state the behavior and the mechanism and the request and the requirements of automatic processing and so on. So it's really important to address that as well. And we are able to do that in ESSArch using these kind of profiles. All these profiles needs to be managed. So we do have a profile manager. I'm going to show you how it works in the tool very soon. And we also need to support the indexing part, because if we do have content that needs to be indexed in order to secure accessibility and search functionality to support internal or external finding and accessing aids, we need to index, and we need to be certain what should be indexed. It's really different if you have a fully large, complex database delivery from a producer to the archive, and if you compare it to just a single delivery, for example, for audio-video material. So it's really different in a sense of how you index things. Of course, we think it's really important to not just cover the submission part. We do think that the submission agreement is very singular in a way that it addresses the submission part, but it is as it is, and we reuse the terms used in OAS and PIMAS and so on. So, but we think it's important to address at very early stages between the stakeholders, between the partners who's about to agree upon something, that we need to, as an archival institution, maintain and preserve according to, could be compliance with laws, legislation, could be our internal guidelines and so on. But we need to cover the preservation planning part, and we need to be able to do those kind of actions over time. A very easy example to address is that from a producer perspective, they will have output of the source system that is represented by physical files that is produced by the Office package. That means that we will have Excel files, we will have Word files and so on. But the preservation or the strategy within the archive institution doesn't allow those sort of file formats. You need to convert them. But who will do that? Who will be responsible of the conversion actions? Could it be, should it be the producer? Could it be, or should it be the archival institution? It's something that you have to decide upon. So we think it's really important to cover the preservation planning and address that in the dialogue during the discussions about the submission agreement. All these needs to be administrated. Who will administrate what? We are able today to separate so that creating profiles is something that a person who has skills and knowledge of standards, of specifications, of the business operation requirements and so on, that person could create a profile, and that could be something that could be administrated, but someone who only knows that I'm going to set up a new submission agreement based on this submission agreement, a technical application submission agreement within ESSAR, and I need to know that I'm going to use these profiles. So I can collect in my role, I'm allowed to, I have the permissions to do that. I am not allowed to do the system administration part of creating the profiles, but I am able to create a submission agreement technically in the system. I'm going to show you what I mean by doing this. But remember, all the details covered in the profiles, as I'm showing you here, they should be in line with the submission agreement. So you need to define and specify a lot of things, and there exist a lot of different kind of checklists. If you're not familiar with any of them, please start with the PIMAS part. The PIs, they are really introductionary into what you should address and so on. I'm curious, I have a question here in the chat box that says, how are these profiles defined? I'm going to show you how they are defined. It takes sort of technical skills today in ESSAR. We have in our product plan to create a simplified graphical user interface to make it much easier, but these profiles are created with some technical skills. I'm going to show you how it's done. Okay. So my last slide before I switch into the application and show you what how it's done in ESSAR. This is the data model on the left hand here, represented in the ESSAR data model, and I've just selected the things that is related to the submission agreement. We do set up different kind of profiles related to a specific submission agreement, and of course these kind of submission agreement and related profiles are used in order to create and support and provide package mechanisms for the information packages, even if it's a SIP or an AIP or a DIP. So this is the data model, and on the right hand we have another way of express what I just showed you on the previous slide. So the thing here is that it's all covered. All these details, all these numbers are covered by the technical application submission agreement that we use and address in and set up in ESSAR. And all of these details should be defined and specified based upon the submission agreement you have between the organizations, the partners who has the agreement settled. All right. So I'm going to switch over to my application here very quickly, and I'm going to show you what it is. Sorry for that. So I do hope that you are able to see the screen on your screen, so the resolution is good enough. But on the left hand here, I have two web browsers. ESSArch is an open source solution, and it's an end-to-end solution covering the whole archival workflow. But today I'm going to just show you what we do with the profile manager part in ESSArch in order to address the topics and the subjects for today's webinar. But ESSArch is, you are able to download ESSArch from the sample software portfolio. What I'm showing you now is a bit of not covered in the version we have in the sample software portfolio, because our release plan internally at the company solution is synchronized and in line with the release plan of eArch3 project. So there is an upcoming release that will be forked into the sample software portfolio on GitHub as well, because there is a version there, and it's from January last year. So it's really urgent to update that one. So it's a open source product, and it's a web-based product from where we use, where I show you two different kind of browsers. No, they're not different in that way. It's the Firefox browser, but I have two windows because I want to show you the differences between different kind of submission agreements. So on the left hand here, I am in the administration part. I'm gonna ask a user who is able to do all these administration part. I'm not able to do the system administration part to create a profile. I'm going to show you what that is, but I'm going to start from a submission agreement perspective. So when I'm in the profile manager, I have already here a few different kind of submission agreements. I'm going to pick up this one. It's specifically a submission agreement that is covering the eArch perspective. And as you can guess, I guess, the one here is covering the Norwegian aspects, and we have below here the Swedish ones. But I'm going to show you a submission agreement and all the profiles I just show you in the slides, and how we create a new submission agreement. So this is one submission agreement that's being published. Published means that it's available. ESSAR can be divided into different kind of functionality. I mean, if you are a producer, you will most certainly use ESSAR from a producer perspective. Simplicity, simple expressed, it means that you don't have all the other menus up here. You only have the producer perspective here. So that means that if I'm a producer and I am going to export information, I'm going to use the ESSAR product in order to create a package, a delivery, and I'm going to do some sort of action. I might be responsible, according to the submission agreement, to do the conversion part, we need to create those Office documents into PDF files, or I'm not. But I'm aware that according to the submission agreement, the archival institution will provide me a published submission agreement so that I can import it into my instance of ESSArch. Therefore, we use the publish term in order to address it, because we, as an archival institution, if I'm for the moment address myself as an archival institution, we have the rights to create the submission agreements technically, and we have the rights to publish them. So we can address. So if we, for example, are a central archive institution and we have 20, 30 different kind of producers out there, we can set up different kind of submission agreements and we can publish them and tell the producer, the specific producer, that you should download this and here's the link. So just import it and you will have everything set up. You will have everything pre-filled. Your metadata, all the details that we agreed upon will be expressly expressed in your creation of the submission, the delivery. So it simplifies and facilitates for many different kind of parties in the sense of using this ability to create and prepare and populate before everything actually occurs in order to address different kind of metadata. So that's the publish thing. So what I'm going to do, I can't change everything here because it's published. So if you see here, if I move over here, there's no possibility to change. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to use this as a template later on, but I'm going to show you something that is, there's a difference here because I had two. And the other one here, it says no index. That means that according to the submission agreement we have, the delivery that we as a producer send to the archive, we as a producer, we know that this is a single delivery. It will occur only once and it will be of no accessibility. It will be very, very much like bit preservation. So there will be only accessibility if requested in dialogue with you as the archival institution. So you will be the only one who will be able to have access to this, so we don't need to index it. That's one perspective that we can use, and it's actually what I'm trying to address in this submission agreement. And the difference here is that indexing part can be done by using different kind of storage policies, because we can index at the latest process step in the overall archival workflow process, so that as close as possible when we store it into the archival storage, we index it, because things can happen along the way. And until that moment, we can do many different kinds of things, but at that moment, we need to index it. So therefore, we have index capability to address within the storage policy, but we also have it according to the profile for the AIP. The profile here for the AIP are able to address certain levels of indexing. And for the moment, we are actually developing within the eArchiving project, with the eArch3 project, support in our core functions to index at different kind of certain levels based upon different kind of content information type specifications. I mean, you most certainly want to index different kind of things if you're delivering geodata to the archival data repository, or if you're indexing healthcare, or if you're indexing personal information or from personal systems. So we are able to today, and will be, because it's ongoing development, to address different kind of levels addressed in this indexing part related to how we actually create the archival information package to be stored in the archive. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to address to you, keep an eye on this. It says AIP eArch, and here it says default. But if I look into that one, it says AIP no index, and it says storage policy no index. So we have two different ones. I know that this one is something that I want to reuse. I want to use this as a template, but I want to create a new submission agreement. Therefore, I reuse this one as a template, but now I know that indexing part will most certainly be on the content. So we will index a very few things according to the policies that we have agreed upon. So, for example, we won't index everything, which we would have done if we have had this one. But we don't want to do that. We do want to index certain specific metadata. So I will keep this one, but I won't keep this one because I'm not comfortable with indexing everything. So I will use a default storage policy, but I won't use it for indexing. And of course, this is the only change I do, but for the moment, I'm doing that. But I can also use different kind of specifications. I mean, I've heard that the eArch specification is really, really good, but we are interested to use a different kind of specification. We are interested to use the specification from Sweden. Yes, that's what we want to do. Do apologize, Jamie, for the moment, talking about Swedish specifications, but this is the submission agreement we have between the archive institution. I'm now operating as an archive institution, and the other parties covered by the submission agreement. So I want to save this one. So I'm going to save it as an eArch versus SC for the moment. And this is a standard set of submission agreement. I'm not sure if this is agreed yet. So I'm going to put this in the draft mode. And it's still labeled as a submission agreement or according to the submission agreement between the organization X and the archive. So I'm going to save this one, and hopefully I won't have any issues in relation to that. Now, if I look into it, it says these are the new one I've added. It's not yet published, and therefore I can change whatever I like here until it is published, but I'm quite satisfied for the moment, so I'm going to publish it. And once I'm published it, we get a confirmation here that it's a published one. And if you look into that now, let's hang on. I can't change anything. All right, so this is the simplest way to create a new technical submission agreement, but it needs to have already set up all the profiles I'm going to use for this. And in the system administration graphical user interface of ESSArch, I do have a section addressing the submission agreements. And here I'm also available as a system administrator to put my hands on the submission agreements, but I'm also able to address a profile. So I'm going to look into the AIP for the no index part. I'm going to have a look at that. And in my previous slides, I addressed that we do have some characteristics to describe, define, to use for the submission agreement. It's a similar thing when you do a profile. So we do have different kind of profile types. We have AIP, we have for transfer with selection, all the thing I showed you in the previous slide. We also have all the characteristics. And here, how we create this kind of information in the profiles, we are able to define the physical structure. This is a package profile. Please keep that in mind. So it might be of interest to create and define the package description, the package, the package structure, the physical and logical structure of the package. That means that you can define the folders you want to use, if it's just simply content or metadata, or if it's a representation, you need to cover your system documentation, so on. You can use these strings and all these details to set up and prepare so that it is easy to use that. So we use JSON, and here the reason why I addressed that you need to have some technical skills. But it's really, really simple if you're familiar with ASCII text and so on. So it's not that different from that part of you. But here we can address explicitly what sort of files that should be addressed in the physical audio structure and so on. Folders, here we have we have a folder named Metadata. It's a type folder. We have schemas. We normally, and most certainly often, do downloading of the schemas so that they are kept in the package as well, so that you know that it was this version that we used for these kind of XML files, if it's an XML file, for example. So this is the structure, the physical. We do have a form template. And this is really interesting because we are able to, I'm going to show you, I've already prepared an example. This one, it's a, here we have a prepared delivery that we've locked to a specific submission agreement. I haven't done that for that one, I can see here, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to do, here's the new one we recently created because it's published. This is a single instance, so you didn't need to publish and import it, so it's available immediately. But I'm going to use this agreement, and I'm going to lock the delivery to that one. And I'm going to have a look at the zip specifications. So here's the zip specification. In those JSON files, you are able to actually prepare. So all the details here is already defined. You are able to decide upon what sort of elements that should be revealed here or presented. You are able to define if it's going to be a hidden one, if it's going to be a disabled one, if it's going to be drop-down list with value lists and so on. So you can actually create any kind of set of metadata in relation to what you, according to your agreement, should use or should provide. So this is the part of the profile that creates the ability to have these as forms. This is forms, all right? And the last one, it gives you the final specification. It gives you how the output, when you create, for example, a zip, the output is based on the standards you use, the specification you use, but the output when creating a package, it creates, if you for example, use the eArch specification for the zips, it creates an XML file. So, and the XML file, how it's structured and how it's put together, it's actually expressed in this JSON file, where you also can address specifically any kind of data. So this is very flexible if you know how to use JSON and how to set up. So a profile consists of all these characteristics up here, definition of the physical and logical structure, how the form should be presented and used, and also how the specification will be used for structure and data in order to create those outputs. That's the rendering part, or as we always discuss, the XML generating will result into. Okay, so now I've showed you how we can actually, as a person who are able to create submission agreements, and those should be, as I already mentioned in the slide, really, really you need to be very certain about that it's covered in the submission agreement you have, because this is just a technical application. So if you have anything wrong in here and it's not in line with the submission agreement, you most certainly have done something wrong in the application. You have done something wrong with the configuration. And if you, as a person who's responsible of creating those submission agreements, logged in as a user who are able to, through the menu administration, the profile manager, create the submission agreement. If you have done your part, you most certainly will be aware of that. It's not your problem if it's not in line with the submission agreement. It most certainly will be a system administrator person who has actually created the profiles used in this. So the roles and the thing that you need to decide upon is really important to do as well, because you most certainly will have different kind of roles within the archival institution, the archive organization, and you won't most certainly, probably not, provide access in order to a producer to create it, because it's something that you will have in dialogue with the producer. But they will most certainly use it if it's their responsibility to create and reuse the technical application of the submission agreement in their creation of the delivery. And it's the opposite. I'm not going to show that because we don't have time, but it's the opposite if we are a consumer and we are trying to access everything. So based upon what we have defined in indexing, you will be able as a consumer to search upon that, to find it and to access it. If it's something that you are required to access, it could be information security that doesn't allow you to see the parts of it or the whole of it that you're asking for or requesting for. But that's a similar thing. So we think that submission agreements should not just cover the submission part. It should cover and agree upon what to be done over the year that this submission agreement is covering. So I'm not covering the preservation action, but you can do this as well. I made an example with the Word or the Excel objects, so to say. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to go back to the presentation, and I'm going to show you this one. Because now I am through with the presentation. I've given you a short introduction to what we address as a submission agreement, how we use that in order to create the technical application and to use it in a most efficient and flexible way with pre-population, so that you, in most cases, just need to do very few clicks in the graphical user interface. I hope it has been interesting, and I will open up for the Q&A right now. I can see that we already have a few questions. I'm going to try to respond to those, and if it's not just question directed addressed to me, I hope that the other presenters will join and explain if there's anything. Yes. First question was, how are these profiles defined? I hope I've showed you that we use this settings of definitions in characteristics and in JSON, 3 different kind of JSON structures to address the physical logical structure, the forms used, and the specification and data within the output of the profile using the profiles. Another question here, is there a character limit for the Q&A? I think that's 159 characters. I'm not sure if that's a question related to the topic or if it's just some sort of issue with the distribution of this webinar. Pavel, what do you say?
Actually, it is 160 characters. It's to provide the questions in succinct ways and for the questions to appear on the screen below the speakers.
So it's a limitation, you mean?
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
The next question we have that's regarding this, for you specifically, is in small business, the preservation is always expensive and many times it seems not accessible. What about making pools for them? Any experience around there?
Yes, but that means I'm not sure about pools, what we do mean by that, because in small businesses, yes, it could be expensive, but if you mean that you could use, for example, I'm just addressing what we have in ESSAR, we are able to separate logically and physically different kind of organizations. That means that we can pool them so that the preservation part could be totally separated. So for example, if you're from one organization and you do have delivered something to that repository, and the repository and the archival institution is responsible for the preservation part, the organization you are represented will not be able to access another organization who's done very similar things, but the archival institution will be able to address them both and access them. So in that sense, you share some of the costs because you can use one singular instance of ESSAR, but you can divide them into physical, logical organization. That means equal to pools in a sense. So you can separate it, but you share cost and you have individual cost. I hope that was a good answer. And what's your addressing? Pavel, shall I go on with the next question here? Or
how does ESSArch deal with certificate management on object level?
That's a good question. Very good question. Certificate management on object level. We do have certificates on the applications and so on, but certificate management on object level, it's a really, really wide discussions and a wide area to discuss certificates and what sort of certificates to be used on a single object, a collection of objects, a package, or whatsoever. But I think it's really important to address that in a submission agreement because certificates is really important to address. There's also always a discussion about how do we maintain certificates over the years because it changes. So on. So I hope that was a good answer for your question. Otherwise, feel free to further explain your question. Okay. It should be possible to organize specific meetings in order to confront the ESSAR software solutions with other platforms. Specific meetings in order to confront. Yes, we do recommend you to explicitly evaluate if the ESSArch in relation to other software components provide the same functionality. In the ER3 project, we do have a set of reference application infrastructure set up at an organization in Sweden called Sydarkivera, where you can actually try out one of the software components in that provided distributed environment, and it's the eArch web. So it's one of the components, but all of the components are you able to download from the eArch sample software portfolio on GitHub. You are also able to, if you just want to try out the ESSAR, to download it and use a setup based upon Docker. So if you're familiar with Docker, you can start and run ESSArch in a single Docker image container instance. I've combined a lot of terminology there related to Docker, but if you're able to do so, you can run the whole functionality in order to do so. And if you prefer to go to the latest version, the nightly build version, you should go to the ES Solutions repository on GitHub. Okay. But if we should organize specific meetings in order to confront the ESSAR software solutions, this is something that I think that we, Jamie, can bring with us into the project, because specific meetings in order to confront or to describe or express or explain certain issues in relation to compare the different kind of software components, that's something that's been addressed and discussed before, but I'm not sure if we have had anything in relation to that yet, a specific meeting
Not
for
yet.
that.
No.
I think it's a good idea, Jamie, to collect that question and put it into the project. Very good question, very good initiative. regarding the certificate management, this is an further expression, I think. Thinking about things like digital signatures, exactly, and transfer authenticity from, say, paper to electronic archives. Yes, we do have different kind of signatures. We do have different kind of requirements in relations to preserve the certificates and so on. So if you address a certificate as a single object related to the content that you are having a certificate for, you are able in ESSArch to address it as a single information object, the certificate, and preserve it in exactly the same way which you do with the object you do have a certificate for. But the mechanism in qualification or certifying that this certificate is valid over the years and so on, you need to add the tools used for those certification mechanisms. But preserving the certificate as a single object, it's fully functional and fully operational, and you are able to do that in ESSArch. If you want to, the person who's addressing the question further express that, please do so. Don't hesitate. Okay. I've got a question here for the pool, a reference to the pool question, I guess. A pool, I say, for example, 3 architects that pay to a professional to build the same tool for them. They have same necessities. In Spanish, mancomunar servicios. I don't know if I spelled that right, but I do understand what you mean. If a person pay 3 times for the same thing one person is building, I think they're robbing you. So don't agree upon that. Don't go with that, because it's something that you could, in most of the applications I'm aware of, address as different instances, or as we do in ESSAR, we do have in a single instance capability to provide separated functionality and to pull those up. I hope that was the answer to your question. Jamie or Powell, do you think that those questions are addressing something different?
I think you answered them fairly well.
Mm.
Jamie, there was one question for you about training Moodles.
We have sent the link.
Perfect.
So, yes.
And according to the training parts, we do have, and hopefully we'll be able to provide training sessions or more explanatory, smaller webinars, more pre-recorded descriptions on how you do things in the ESSAR family. I'm not sure if this will be covered in total within the ER3 project, because it's just 4 months left of the project and we are heading towards summer. So, but it will be available. I guess few of them will be available in or through the ER3 project. We've got another question here. I'm not sure about that question. I can't understand that question. It says, the CA question coincides with our plans to map things from an OID perspective. We need to transfer authenticity through media conversion, not regarding storage.
So the certificate management question.
Yes, it's related to the certificate. Yes, I would address those transfer actions through media conversion. It could be a combination of transforming, it could be a converting issue, but if you need to have those certificates with you in order to ensure before and after you do those actions, it's something that we would like to look into, but we don't have those kind of relationships between certificates and single objects in those kind of actions? Good question, really good question. The certificate part is really is a wide area to discuss because it's so many different things that occurs according to those requirements related to certificates. All right. Any other question?
I do not see any. I think you've answered everything completely. And
we're a little bit behind schedule, but I think that will be fine. Don't hesitate. We will follow up any questions in relation to it. Don't hesitate to contact the project or me in person if you have any questions whatsoever in relation to this webinar. I say thank you all. I'll hand it over to you, Pavel and or Jamie.
Pavel?
Well, thank you all for joining this webinar. As Jamie alluded to before, this is the last webinar before our summer break. So please look out for updates on our event page. We will, as the webinars will continue on starting from September. So please be on the lookout for all updates, and they will be posted on the event page for all of you. Thank you, Bjorn, for a fantastic two-part webinar series, number 13 and 14. You've done a fantastic job, and I think your webinars are comprehensive and very, very enjoyable. Jamie, any last words?
Yes, if I could. I'd like to say a few words of thanks. As you said, this is the last webinar of the spring season, and we'll be resuming in September. Just wanted to thank a few people for everything that's happened up until now. Obviously, we need to thank our speakers. We've had 10 different speakers during the season who've given up their time to present, so thank you. And obviously, Pavel and Tom, thank you both for all the support you've given the webinars this season and previously. It's always an absolute pleasure to work with you both. Thank you. Also, let's not forget that there's lots of people behind the scenes who you never hear about. Honestly, we don't just roll up on Thursday morning and hope for the best. There are lots of people behind the scenes who work with the technology. They work with the streaming, with the social media. They do the marketing. We couldn't do this without you, so thank you all. And finally, thank you, the audience, for being so supportive over the last 4 months. It really is nice to know that we've got regular listeners who are there for us, and to know that we are potentially doing something to support your journey in eArchiving. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again in September. So thank you.
And I do have to say thanks to you, Jamie, for being the head organizer of all of these webinars, because without you, none of this would be possible. So someone needs to say thanks, and I do say thanks to you. But I guess this does round out our webinar number 14. Thank you all for listening, and I will see all of you in September.